The sound came first, not a shout, not a command, just the flat percussive crack of a human body meeting cold steel, the kind of sound that makes every person in a room go absolutely still, the way animals go still when they hear something that doesn't belong in the natural order of things. The server rack didn't move. It weighed 1,100 pounds and was bolted to the floor of the NCLS-1 Cerberus command deck with the same deliberate permanence that the Navy applied to everything it built to last. The woman pressed against it, however, was not bolted to anything. She had simply stopped, her back against the metal, her tablet still in her hand, her eyes the color of deep water on a cloudy morning level, and unhurried looking up at the man who had put her there. Captain Robert Calloway did not step back. He leaned in. He was 6 feet 2 inches of decorated naval officer, 44 years old, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and hands that had gripped the wheel of a guided missile destroyer in 40-foot Atlantic swells without trembling. He had been awarded the Legion of Merit. He had been photographed for the cover of a magazine. He had buried men he loved and kept walking. There was not a room in the United States Navy that Robert Calloway could enter and not immediately become the most commanding presence in it. He was also at this precise moment completely and utterly wrong. He just didn't know it yet. His voice came out low, controlled, the kind of low that is more dangerous than a shout because it tells you the man speaking has done this before and has learned that volume is wasted energy. "I told you once," he said. "I won't tell you again. This deck is restricted. You are not authorized to be here. Identify yourself or I will have you removed." The woman said nothing. Calloway's jaw tightened. Behind him spread across a cavernous room, humming with the cold blue light of 100 active consoles. 24 junior officers and enlisted technicians stood in the particular frozen posture of people who desperately want to be somewhere else. They had heard the captain give that tone before. They knew what came after it. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that the woman pressed against the server rack had designed the room they were standing in, that she had written by hand the foundational architecture of every system currently glowing blue and green around them, that the tablet she was holding contained, among other things, a flaw she herself had hidden inside this facility's most critical protocol, a flaw she had placed there deliberately like a surgeon, leaving a single suture inside a patient's chest, specifically to see whether anyone would ever find it. None of them knew any of that. But one person in the room was beginning to suspect. Commodore Harlan Briggs stood near the aft entrance, slightly in shadow, a grizzled man of 58, with the broad shoulders of someone who had spent decades at sea and the careful eyes of someone who had spent even longer watching what happened when proud men misread quiet people. He had seen her the moment she entered. He had recognized something in the way she moved, not the specific recognition of a face, but the deeper recognition of a type. The kind of person who occupies exactly as much space as the situation requires and never performs the excess. The kind of person who, when pushed against a wall, does not grab for the wall. She had absorbed the impact, redirected it, and now she was simply waiting. Briggs felt the cold begin at the base of his spine. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He watched the way a man watches something he is not yet certain he is really seeing. This is the story of 11 minutes that began with a sound like a body meeting steel and ended with something that the people who witnessed it would spend the rest of their careers trying to put into language. They would mostly fail. The language that exists for moments like this, the language of competence so deep it becomes invisible until it is the only thing in the room, is not a language that fills out well in official reports. What happened on the Cerberus command deck on that afternoon in the spring of 2024 was not an act of revenge. It was not a display. It was not, despite what the legend would later claim, a miracle. It was simply what happens when a system meets the person who built it. And it was what happens when a man who has spent his entire life being the loudest voice in every room finally for the first time has to listen. By the time those 11 minutes were over, Captain Robert Calloway's career would be finished. A catastrophic systems failure that threatened the lives of everyone on that deck would be resolved by a woman with a tablet and a cable thin as a shoelace. And a 24-year-old ensign named Garrett Kowalski, standing near the back of the room with a notepad he'd been too embarrassed to put away, would witness something that would reroute the entire course of his life. But first you need to understand who these people were before they walked into that room. Because the story doesn't start with the sound of a body meeting steel. It starts 23 years before that in a different kind of darkness. Robert Calloway grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, 45 minutes from Parris Island, in a house where his father ate dinner in a pressed uniform every night, whether he was going anywhere or not. The Navy wasn't a choice for Calloway, the way it is a choice for most people. It was gravity. It was the shape of the world. He entered the Naval Academy at 18 and graduated fourth in his class. He was not the smartest man in his cohort, and he knew it, and it drove him harder than any smartest man in his cohort had ever been driven. What Calloway had in place of raw analytical genius was something rarer and more immediately useful in wartime. He could read a physical situation with the speed and accuracy of a machine. Deck angles, wind patterns, the particular way a helmsman's shoulders tensed before he made an error. Calloway processed these things the way other people process language. Fluently, automatically, without having to think. In the spring of 2019, during what the official report would later call Severe Weather Event Category 4 in the North Atlantic, Calloway commanded the guided missile destroyer USS Carver through 48 consecutive hours of conditions that should, by all statistical probability, have broken the ship in half and sent every soul aboard to the bottom of the ocean. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He positioned himself at the helm, and he held it not metaphorically but literally, his hands on the wheel, his body braced against the motion of a vessel being thrown around by forces that outweighed it by several orders of magnitude, and he brought all 238 members of his crew home alive. Time magazine ran a photograph the Secretary of the Navy called. There were letters. What the letters did not say, because letters of that kind never say the uncomfortable things, was that Calloway's greatest limitation was also the same quality that made him extraordinary in a storm. He was a man built for the physical world, for the world of weather and steel and human bodies making decisions under pressure, the world of networks and architecture and systems that existed as pure information, as code and logic and invisible structures of cause and effect. That world was not real to him in the way the Atlantic was real to him. He did not distrust it exactly. He simply did not respect it the way he respected things that could kill you with their hands. He called cyber warfare in private, and occasionally not in private, a job for people who couldn't pass the physical. He had said it twice in the past month aboard Cerberus. Everyone on the deck had heard him. Claire Donovan had not heard him say it, but she already knew. She was born in Portland, Maine in 1972, the daughter of an electrical engineer and a woman who had taught mathematics at the University of Southern Maine for 31 years. She was the kind of child who took apart household appliances, not out of mischief, but out of a genuine and unsettling desire to understand how they worked and who could, at the age of 11, put them back together correctly. She entered MIT at 17 on a full academic scholarship, completed a bachelor's in electrical engineering in 3 years, and then, to the considerable confusion of her faculty advisor, enlisted in the United States Navy. She was not a person who explained her decisions. The Navy in the early 1990s was not entirely certain what to do with a 20-year-old female ensign who held advanced degrees in 2 engineering disciplines and moved through the world with the unhurried assurance of someone who had already solved most of the problems everyone else was just now noticing. They put her in communications. She rewrote the communications protocol she had been assigned to maintain within the first month. She was reprimanded for changing something she had not been authorized to change. She accepted the reprimand without comment and went back to work. This pattern would repeat itself with minor variations for the next decade. By 2001, she was a lieutenant commander, 29 years old, working under the direct command of Vice Admiral Wallace Reed at the Defense Advanced Systems Integration Group in Washington. Reed was 61, a thin, deliberate man who had spent 30 years watching the United States military build brilliant technology and then staff it with people who understood almost none of what they were operating. He had a particular talent for identifying the engineers who were different, who understood not just how to use a system, but how to see it to inhabit its logic the way a musician inhabits a piece of music rather than just pressing the correct keys in sequence. He had identified Claire Donovan in the first 15 minutes of their first meeting. "You're going to spend most of your career," he told her once in the particular direct way he reserved for people he trusted enough to be honest with, "being dismissed by people who are afraid of what they don't understand. The only thing that matters is whether you let it stop you." She had not answered him. She had looked at the schematics on his desk. He had taken that as the best possible answer. In the fall of 2001, Reed authorized a network defense architecture that Donovan had developed over 18 months, a layered system designed to protect fleet communications against the kind of sophisticated cyber intrusion that most of the Navy did not yet believe was a real threat. The system was elegant. It was years ahead of anything the private sector was building. And it had a flaw, a small and specific flaw that Donovan had identified 2 weeks before the system went live and had been trying to resolve when a senior officer she did not work for, a man named Crawford, who had a deep and vocal contempt for what he called computer theory walked into her workspace and told her to stop making changes to a system that had already been approved. She tried to explain. Crawford was not interested in explanations. He was a man who had spent 30 years in a world where the chain of command was the chain of command, and a junior officer rewriting approved systems without authorization was a junior officer who needed to understand where she stood. She stood down. 7 weeks later, a targeted intrusion exploited exactly the vulnerability she had identified. Two naval intelligence officers whose communications were routed through the compromised system were exposed during an operation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Both were killed within 72 hours. Wallace Reed resigned his commission 6 months later. He told Donovan in a quiet hallway outside a briefing room where neither of them had said what they needed to say that it was not her fault, that she had done the correct thing and had been prevented from doing it correctly, that the fault lived with Crawford and with the system that had produced Crawford. She listened to all of this. She thanked him. She went back to work. Went back to that night in her apartment. She opened the hardware case of the compromised network terminal she had been permitted to keep as reference material. She removed a single interface cable copper core legacy connector type, the kind of cable that would be obsolete within 5 years and was already being phased out in most installations. She coiled it carefully. She put it in her pocket. She had not gone a single day without it since. 23 years, several dozen postings, 3 deployments, 2 doctorates quantum computing from MIT Systems Architecture from Caltech, the Navy's most classified cyber warfare certification program, 8 years designing and building NCS-1 Cerberus from its foundational code outward, a project so sensitive that the people currently assigned to operate the facility had received their briefings with certain sections redacted. The cable was thin. It weighed almost nothing. It had traveled with her to every room, every posting, every briefing, where a man like Crawford had looked at her without seeing her and made a decision that would ripple outward in ways he would never be required to account for. She had never plugged it into anything. Not once in 23 years. She brought it because she needed to remember what it cost to be too late. The Pentagon conference was in October of 2021. Calloway didn't know the woman's name. He was not required to know it. She was not in his chain of command, not in his operational theater, not relevant to any of the briefing materials he had prepared for the day. She was simply a woman in a plain gray suit who had arrived early and sat in the second row and said almost nothing for the entire 3-hour session on modernizing fleet network infrastructure. The session was contentious. There were arguments about allocation. There were arguments about whether the current generation of cyber specialists was being properly integrated into combat commands. There were several men who spoke at considerable length about things they understood imperfectly, with the particular confidence that comes from being accustomed to having rooms listen to you. The woman in the gray suit listened. She took notes on a small legal pad, writing in a narrow, even script. Once, when a senior officer made a specific technical claim about network redundancy protocols, Calloway saw the pencil pause over the paper. Pause and then not write, as if she had considered whether the claim was worth recording and decided it was not. He had thought in the way you think about strangers in conference rooms, when part of your mind is somewhere else, probably an analyst. One of the hundreds of civilian contractors and intelligence support staff who move through these sessions like background noise, gathering information for reports that people like Calloway would skim and file. He had not asked her name. He had not, if he was honest with himself, looked at her face long enough to remember it. Standing now in the blue-lit chill of the Cerberus command deck, his hand still near the server rack, his pulse still elevated from the confrontation he had just initiated. Standing here, he was starting to feel something that was not exactly memory and not exactly recognition. Something closer to the feeling you get when a word you can't remember is right at the edge of your mind. A gravitational pull toward a thought he wasn't ready to complete. He had seen those eyes before. He had seen them in a room full of important people being unimpressed by all of them. He pushed the thought down. He was the commanding officer of this facility. He had a situation in front of him, and he was going to resolve it. Last time he said, "Name and authorization code, now." The woman looked at him. Not through him, not past him, at him with the focused attention of someone conducting an examination. Her expression had no anger in it, no fear, no social discomfort. It had what Calloway, in the part of his mind that would spend years afterward replaying this moment, could only describe as clinical patience. The patience of a diagnostician who has already identified the problem and is simply waiting for the patient to finish speaking so the real work can begin. She still did not answer. Behind Calloway, near the main console cluster, Ensign Garrett Kowalski was not doing what he was supposed to be doing. He was supposed to be monitoring the secondary data feeds from the Black Spear wargame scenario currently running in the system's simulation layer. He was 24 years old, 6 months out of the academy, and had the distinguishing quality rare enough in any profession, nearly extinct in any military hierarchy, of noticing things that were not directly related to his assigned task. What he was noticing now was that the woman pressed against the server rack had not in the 40 seconds since the confrontation began looked at any of the screens around her. Not the main holographic display, not the tactical boards, not the console clusters where his fellow technicians were frozen in uncertain attention. She had looked only at Captain Calloway. And before that, when she had been standing freely near the primary command node, she had been looking at the floor, at a specific section of floor near the far wall. Kowalski followed the line of her earlier gaze backward, the way you trace a sound back to its source, and found himself looking at the base of the far wall where a secondary maintenance conduit ran beneath a panel that hadn't been opened, judging by the dust on its fasteners in what looked like years. He looked back at the woman. He looked at the tablet in her hand. He had a thought that made no immediate sense to him, a thought that arrived the way important thoughts often arrive, not as a conclusion, but as a question wearing a conclusion's clothes. She is not lost. She is exactly where she wants to be. He wrote that down on his notepad before he understood why. The alarm started as a flicker, a single anomalous line of red appearing in the upper right corner of the main holographic display, thin as a paper cut in a field of stable blue. Within seconds, it was not alone. The second line appeared, then the third. By the fourth, they were no longer individual anomalies. They were a pattern, and the pattern was accelerating. The young technician at the primary monitoring station was the first to speak. His voice came out higher than he intended. "Captain, I'm seeing a cascade event on the primary display." Calloway turned. The field of blue on the main holographic display was shifting. The red lines were multiplying with the quiet efficiency of a biological event, not spreading from a single point, but appearing simultaneously across the grid as if the system were not failing in one place, but awakening to a failure that had been present invisibly everywhere at once. The first alarm tone sounded. Then the second, then the third. Calloway moved to the command station with the physical decisiveness of a man who had spent 20 years responding to emergencies. And in the fraction of a second before he reached it, before his hands found the console surface, and his training began running its automatic sequences, he registered in his peripheral vision something that would stay with him for a very long time. The woman near the server rack had not moved. She had closed her eyes, not in fear, not in distress, in the particular inward way that a person closes their eyes when they are listening for something specific, when they need the visual world to go quiet so that the other information can be heard clearly. When, in other words, they already know what this is. She opened them again after 3 seconds. Her expression had not changed at all except for something very small at the corners of her eyes, something that in different circumstances Calloway might have called relief. She reached into the left breast pocket of her flight suit. She removed the cable. She looked at it for one moment, not with hesitation, but with the focused attention of someone acknowledging something before they use it. Then she began walking toward the far wall, not toward the main consoles where a dozen trained technicians were now moving with increasing urgency through protocols that would not work. Not toward the command station where Calloway was issuing orders into a system that could no longer hear them. Toward the secondary maintenance conduit at the base of the far wall, the panel with the dusty fasteners, the place no one had thought to look, the place she had been looking at since the moment she walked in. Garrett Kowalski, standing 6 feet away, with his notepad in his hand, watched her cross the deck with the steady, purposeful stride of someone who has been waiting 23 years to finish something. He did not stop her. He did not ask questions. He turned to a fresh page on his notepad and prepared to write down everything he was about to see. Because even at 24, even 6 months into his first real posting, with alarms climbing the scale around him and the command deck beginning its descent into something that was no longer theoretical, even then, some part of Garrett Kowalski understood that what was happening in this room was not simply a crisis. It was a lesson. And he intended to take notes, not 2 minutes into the crisis, 2 minutes into the part of the crisis where every person on the server's command deck understood with the particular clarity that arrives only when training has run out of answers that they were in genuine trouble. The synthesized voice that delivered the warning was calm in the way that only machines can be calm, not because it had assessed the situation and found reason for composure, but because it was incapable of registering what calm actually costs. It simply spoke into the red-lit room with the flat authority of a recorded announcement. System integrity compromised. Protocol Omega engaged. All command functions locked. Core coolant systems at risk. Personnel are advised to initiate emergency evacuation procedures. Nobody moved, not because they were frozen by fear, though some of them were. Not because they had failed to hear, though the alarm tones were now layered 4 deep and had driven the ambient sound of the room to a pitch that made normal thought effortful. They did not move because leaving through the reinforced steel doors that the system had already sealed as part of its lockdown sequence was not something they could do. The same protocol that was telling them to evacuate had removed their ability to comply. Protocol Omega had locked the building. They were inside a system that was simultaneously ordering them out and refusing to let them go. Robert Calloway understood this approximately 8 seconds after the evacuation warning sounded. He had spent 20 years in emergency situations, and the specific skill that distinguished him from the men around him in those situations was not courage, though he had that, and not physical capability, though he had that as well. It was the speed with which he could strip a situation down to its actual structure. Cut away the noise, the secondary concerns, the instinctive responses that felt urgent but weren't load-bearing, and find the single essential fact that everything else depended on. The essential fact here was this: the cooling systems for the Cerberus facility's quantum processing core were controlled by Protocol Omega. Protocol Omega was currently in a corrupted loop state, and the supercooled liquid helium that kept the core from reaching temperatures that would destroy every piece of hardware in the facility and do significant harm to every person in it was less than 10 minutes from an automated venting sequence that the system had misclassified as a necessary emergency response. Calloway had been briefed on Protocol Omega when he took command of Cerberus 14 months ago. The briefing had been thorough. He had read every page. He had asked questions and received answers and signed the documentation confirming his understanding. What he understood, standing at the command station with his hands on a console that no longer responded to his input, was that understanding a system in a briefing room and understanding a system in the 40 seconds before it causes a catastrophe are two entirely different kinds of understanding, and he only had one of them. He turned to his senior systems engineer. Override the lockdown, manual protocol. Authorization Calloway Delta, 779er. The engineer, a lieutenant commander named Hatch, who had been stationed at Cerberus for 3 years and knew its systems better than any other officer on the deck, was already shaking his head before Calloway finished the authorization code. It's not responding to manual override, Captain. The system has categorized our inputs as part of the intrusion event. It's treating our commands as the attack. Then go around it. Sir, I'm trying. The maintenance terminals are locked behind the primary. Then get to a maintenance terminal. Get underneath it. Whatever you have to do. Hatch turned back to his station. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the speed of genuine expertise, not the frantic random motion of panic, but the deliberate, methodical progression of someone working a problem from first principles. He tried 6 approaches in 90 seconds. Each one hit the same wall. The system logged his attempts, noted that they matched the behavioral signature of a counter-intrusion effort, and incorporated them into its evidence that something was trying to compromise its integrity from within. Protocol Omega was eating their rescue attempts and using them to justify locking down harder. On the main holographic display, which had ceased showing the Black Spear war game scenario and was now rendering a real-time system status map, a countdown had appeared. White numerals against the red field, large enough to read from the back of the room. 9 minutes 41 seconds. 9 minutes 40. 9 minutes 39. Calloway looked at the countdown for a long moment. He had stood at a ship's helm in a storm that should have killed him and had found somewhere in his chest the specific quality of stillness that is not the absence of fear, but the decision to set it aside and get to work. He found that quality now. He set down the fear and he looked around his command deck with the focused assessment of a man taking inventory. What he had: 23 personnel, most of them trained systems operators at a high level of competence. A room full of hardware that was not currently responding to any of them. One set of sealed emergency exits, 9 minutes and 32 seconds. What he needed: someone who could get underneath Protocol Omega's logic and communicate with the core architecture directly, not through the command interface that the system had locked, but through a pathway the system had not thought to close. He did not have that person. He began issuing orders anyway. Hatch, keep working the manual override. Martinez, get on the emergency line to Naval Station Norfolk Main Command. Wheeler, I want eyes on every secondary terminal in this facility. Find me something that's not locked. Jenkins, get those emergency doors open manually. There are release pins on the interior panel. Use them. The orders were good orders. They were exactly what a competent commanding officer would issue in this situation, and the people receiving them were exactly competent enough to execute them well. But they could not, through any of these approaches, reach the actual problem. Because the actual problem was not in the command interface. It was not in the manual override layer. It was not in any of the systems architecture that the command deck personnel had been trained to operate, because it lived below all of those things in the foundational code that predated Cerberus's official construction phase in the original logic structure that had been written by one person working alone and had never in the 11 years since been fully opened to external review. The countdown passed 8 minutes. In a different part of the room, things were happening that had nothing to do with the orders Calloway had just given. Garrett Kowalski was 24 years old, and he had been taking notes. He had started writing in the first seconds of the alarm, because writing was what his hands did when his brain was processing something faster than normal. The notepad was regulation issue. The pen was a blue Bic he had borrowed from the supply room on his third day and never returned. He wrote in a small, fast print, not cursive because print was faster, and legibility mattered when you intended to go back and understand something later. He had filled one page and was halfway through a second. What he had written was not standard incident documentation. It was something closer to a transcript of his observations, specifically the physical behavior of the woman in the olive flight suit who was currently kneeling at the base of the far wall, working at a maintenance panel that no one else had so much as glanced at since the alarms began. She had not looked at the main display since the crisis started. He had checked this 4 times. Each time her attention had been directed elsewhere, at the maintenance panel, at the tablet in her hand. Once briefly at Kowalski himself, and in that fraction of a second of eye contact, he had felt something he did not have language for but wrote down, as she is not surprised by any of this. Now she was opening the panel with her hands, no tools, the fasteners responding to pressure, in a specific sequence that Kowalski was reasonably certain was not documented in any manual he had access to. She inserted the cable she had been carrying into a port inside the conduit housing. The other end connected to her tablet. He wrote she knew this port would work. She knew before she came in. He underlined the sentence, then circled it, then looked up. Behind him, Calloway was still issuing orders. The countdown was at 7 minutes 12 seconds. Hatch had found a secondary pathway into the override layer and was pursuing it with the focused intensity of a man who knows he probably cannot succeed and is going to try anyway. Martinez had reached Norfolk Main Command and was explaining the situation to someone who clearly did not understand it. Jenkins was at the emergency door with his arms inside the release pin panel, his body shaking with effort. These were good, trained, dedicated people doing everything right. None of it was going to matter because the problem was not in any of the places they were looking. The woman's fingers began to move across her tablet screen. Kowalski had watched skilled people work before. He had grown up watching his father rebuild boat engines in their garage in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and his father's hands during that work had a quality he had spent his whole childhood trying to find words for, not speed exactly and not precision exactly, but something that combined both of those things with an organic fluency that made each motion seem continuous with the motion before it, as if the work was not a series of separate actions, but a single long, unbroken action that merely paused occasionally to let the materials catch up. That was what he was watching now. Her fingers moved across the tablet surface in sequences that bore no relationship to any interface gesture he had ever seen. Not the standard tap and swipe of normal operation, but something more specific and more complex, a language of input that had clearly been developed for this particular system over a very long time. Lines of code appeared on her screen, scrolled, branched, resolved. She was not navigating menus. She was not working through a troubleshooting tree. She was writing directly into the system's native language, below every interface layer, below the architecture, that Hatch and his team had been trained on in a level of the code that most of the people on this deck did not know existed. The countdown passed 6 minutes. She did not look at the countdown. There is a particular quality of attention that develops in people who have spent decades doing a single kind of work at the highest level, a quality that looks from the outside like stillness, but is actually something closer to total occupation. Every available unit of cognitive capacity directed inward toward the problem, leaving nothing to maintain the performance of awareness. The face goes quiet, the body settles. The person becomes, for the duration of that focus, entirely somewhere else, somewhere inside the work. Claire Donovan was somewhere inside the work. She had been there in some form or another for 23 years. The flaw inside Protocol Omega was specific and known to her because she had put it there. A recursive loop embedded in the response architecture of the Black Spear's scenario data designed to trigger under one particular combination of inputs that no standard wargame would ever produce accidentally, but which she had built into the scenario's parameters as a tripwire. If that loop activated, it would initiate exactly what was happening, now a false positive intrusion event, that the system would then misread as an escalating external attack, causing it to respond with increasing severity to its own defensive actions. It was a perfect trap, a system that fought itself into collapse while every attempt to intervene from the outside fed the panic. Impossible to resolve through the command interface. Invisible to anyone who hadn't written the architecture it lived inside. She had designed it in 2012. She had briefed precisely one person on its existence, Wallace Reed, who had been retired for 10 years at that point, and who had listened with the particular expression he reserved for things that impressed him deeply, which was almost no expression at all. And if it ever activates, he had asked, then whoever is running this facility will learn something important about what they do and don't understand, she had said. And if they can't fix it, she had been quiet for a moment. Then I will. Reed had looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the first time they met, with that clear diagnostic attention that saw past the professional surface to the person underneath. You're planning to come back, he had said. Eventually, she had said, I always come back to what I haven't finished. He had died in 2018. A stroke quiet in his study in Annapolis, surrounded by books and framed schematics of systems he had championed and watched become obsolete. His daughter had called Donovan because she was in his address book under a single initial. There had been a small service. Donovan had stood at the back and left before anyone could speak to her. That night, she had taken the cable out of her pocket and held it for a long time. The countdown was at 4 minutes 53 seconds when she found the loop. It was exactly where she had put it, nested inside the Black Spear scenario's subroutine architecture, like a splinter in a finger invisible until you pressed the right way, and then suddenly the only thing you could feel. She isolated it with 3 lines of code, contained it with 2 more, began the process of unwinding the recursive logic that had been feeding on itself for the past 7 minutes, generating false positive upon false positive. Each one more alarming than the last, each severe response generating a new false positive in turn. It was like talking someone down from the edge. You did not argue with the panic. You did not override it. You went to the place underneath it, and you acknowledged what was real and what was not real, and you waited with absolute patience for the system to hear you. The countdown was at 4 minutes 9 seconds. She began to work. Kowalski was close enough to hear her. Not that typing her fingers made almost no sound on the tablet surface. What he heard was her breathing measured and deliberate in through the nose and out through the mouth at an interval that had long ago become automatic. And beneath the breathing, once very quietly, so quietly that he would never be entirely certain he had heard it correctly, something that was not a command and not a technical notation. A name. Admiral Reed. I know where it is now. I won't be late this time. He wrote it down before he fully registered what he had heard. Then he looked up. Robert Calloway was standing 6 feet away. He had stopped issuing orders. Not because the crisis had resolved, the countdown was still running, the alarms were still sounding, the doors were still sealed. He had stopped because something had interrupted the trained response pattern that had been running his behavior for the past 8 minutes. Something that slipped through the channels of automatic action and touched something underneath that had not been operational in a very long time. He had heard her too. In 24 years of naval service, Robert Calloway had been present at the deaths of 4 men he served with. He had attended services and folded flags and written letters and done all the formal things the Navy had given him a structure for doing. He had never been entirely sure in the years afterward that any of it had addressed the central fact, which was that the men were gone and the people who were left had to figure out how to continue. He had his own version of not being late. He had carried it differently than she did in the hypervigilance that made him the first one awake every morning, in the compulsion to verify every decision twice in the particular way he took the helm, in bad weather always slightly earlier than the situation technically required, always with one extra measure of attention to spare. He had never told anyone about this. It was not the kind of thing you told people. But he knew it when he heard it. I know where it is now. I won't be late this time. He stood in a room that was still red-lit and alarm-filled and counting down toward potential catastrophe, and for the first time in the duration of this crisis, he was not thinking about commands or protocols or chains of authority. He was thinking about the fact that whoever she was, whatever she was doing, she had been carrying something for a very long time. The same way he had. He did not speak. He did not move closer. His hands, which had been clenched throughout the crisis, opened slowly at his sides. Not a gesture of surrender, not a performance of anything, just the natural release that happens in a body when it stops bracing for impact. He let her work. It was in its quiet way the most difficult thing he had done all day. On the main holographic display, something changed. It was small at first, a single thin line of white appearing in the upper section of the red static field. Straight and clean and exact. The line held. Then slowly it began to curve. The red field did not recede immediately. It held its ground, the way a tide holds before it turns that moment of stillness between the in and the out. That is so brief most people miss it entirely. But it was turning. The curve became 3/4 complete. The first alarm went silent. Not gradually. Simply off present, 1 second, absent the next. Its absence creating a space in the room's soundscape that felt physical, like a hand removed from a shoulder. In that space, the next alarm sounded more isolated, more specific, and then it too fell silent. Donovan's fingers did not slow. The white line completed its circle. The second bank of alarms went out. The third. The red field on the holographic display began to fragment at its edges, each piece resolving back into the clean, tactical data it had been before Protocol Omega overwhelmed it. Like fog burning off a coast as the sun comes through. Like a diagnosis arriving after weeks of unspecified symptoms, the relief not only that the problem is known, but that it is named, and naming it means that what comes next can be chosen deliberately instead of endured blindly. The countdown reached 3 minutes and 14 seconds, and stopped. Not because the time had run out, because the sequence it was measuring no longer existed. The facility's environmental systems settled simultaneously into their normal operational state, with a sound that Kowalski could only describe afterward as a collective exhale, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. The emergency lighting shifted. Red became blue. The cold, clean, operational blue of a facility running correctly, of a system that had found its way back to what it was built to be. In the silence that followed, no one spoke for a long moment, not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much and no one had yet determined what the first necessary thing was. Donovan unplugged the cable. She coiled it with the same unhurried practice motion she had used for 23 years. The left-hand loop first, then the right, the connector ends aligned at the center, the whole thing compressed into the compact form it always took when it was not in use. She placed it back in the left breast pocket of her flight suit. She smoothed the pocket flat. She stood. She looked at the system for one last moment, not with satisfaction exactly and not with relief, with something more careful than either of those things. The look of someone who has resolved one problem and has not yet forgotten that problems of this kind rarely arrive alone. Then she turned, and the eyes that met Robert Calloway's across the length of the Cerberus command deck were the same eyes he had been unable to make respond to his commands for the past 14 minutes. Still the deep water gray. Still without anger. Still without fear. But there was something in them now that had not been there when he pressed her against the server rack. Something that had done what it came to do and was not yet finished. Calloway held her gaze. He was not accustomed to the feeling currently spreading through him. Not shame exactly, though shame was part of it, the specific scouring quality of a realignment. The sensation of a worldview that has been structurally intact for decades, developing suddenly and, without warning, a crack along a load-bearing wall. He had called this work a job for people who couldn't pass the physical. He looked at the woman who had just saved 43 lives with a cable she had been carrying for 23 years. He could not find the sentence that should come next. At the aft entrance, Commodore Harlan Briggs stepped forward from the shadow where he had been standing, his face set in the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment to arrive and is feeling in its arrival something that is equal parts relief and grief. He had been right about what he thought he had recognized. He had hoped he was wrong. He walked toward her across the blue-lit deck. Behind him, Garrett Kowalski turned to a fresh page in his notepad. He had stopped writing during the final minutes of her work, had simply watched because watching had seemed more important than recording. But now he wrote in the small, fast print he had been using all afternoon the last note he would take before everything changed. She knew the whole time. He looked at what he had written. He drew a box around it. Then he looked up at the woman standing in the center of the room, cable in her pocket, tablet in her hand, waiting with the patience of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has learned that the right moment arrives on its own schedule and not before. And he waited too. Commodore Harlan Briggs had rehearsed this moment, not deliberately, not in the way a man rehearses a speech or a difficult conversation sitting alone with the words until they come out cleanly. He had rehearsed it the way you rehearse things you are afraid of in the unguarded minutes before sleep, in the middle of long drives, in the particular quiet that follows a loud argument, when the noise has cleared and what remains is the truth you were avoiding. He had been rehearsing it for 3 years since the day he first read the classified section of the Cerberus facility briefing and understood with the cold certainty that comes from genuine intelligence exactly who had built the room he was about to oversee. He had hoped she would never come, not because he feared her, because he feared what her arrival would mean about the state of the facility she had built. An unannounced personal inspection from the lead architect meant one thing: she had a reason. And reasons of that kind in Briggs's experience were never small. He stopped 3 feet from her. He drew himself to his full height. And then Commodore Harlan Briggs, a man who had commanded carrier strike groups and who carried 32 years of service in the set of his shoulders, executed the sharpest salute of his career. Not the casual exchange of officers greeting one another in a corridor, not the efficient acknowledgement of a senior passing through a space. The formal, precise, held salute of a subordinate to a superior whose rank and record demanded nothing less, offered freely by a man who understood exactly what he was saluting and why. "Admiral Donovan," he said, his voice carried across the silent deck with absolute steadiness. "My apologies for the reception. I was not informed you would be conducting the inspection personally. This facility is yours to command." The word moved through the room like a current through still water. "Admiral." It reached the junior technicians first, the young petty officers and ensigns who registered it first as a sound, and then as a meaning, and then as an implication that restructured everything they had witnessed in the past 14 minutes. It moved through the senior staff more slowly, meeting more resistance, requiring more cognitive renegotiation of what they believed they had understood. And it arrived last and heaviest at the command station, where Captain Robert Calloway stood and felt the ground open beneath him. He had physically assaulted a flag officer. He had pressed a full admiral against a wall and threatened her with the brig. He had called this work, in this woman's presence and in this woman's building, a job for people who couldn't pass the physical. The specifics arrived one at a time, each with its own weight, and he bore them without looking for exits. He was not a man who looked for exits when he was wrong. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, and he looked at the woman he had failed to see. Donovan gave Briggs a slight nod, neither warm nor cold, simply present. Then she looked at the main holographic display, now fully restored, the clean blue tactical field of the Black Spear scenario, sitting exactly where it had been before Protocol Omega tore through it. She studied it for a moment. "Commodore," she said. Her voice was the first full sentence most of them had heard her speak. It was measured and unhurried. The kind of voice that does not need a room to go quiet before it speaks because the room goes quiet on its own. "Your facility has a structural flaw in its core architecture. Protocol Omega contains a recursive loop embedded in the Black Spear scenario subroutine. Under a specific combination of inputs, the loop generates a cascading false positive that the system interprets as an escalating external attack. Each defensive response the system generates feeds the loop. The lockdown compounds the error. Without intervention at the architectural level, the sequence terminates in core coolant failure." She paused. "Your command staff was not prepared for a systems-level cascade failure. They are trained to operate this facility. They are not trained to understand it. That distinction is a critical vulnerability." She turned and looked directly at Calloway, not with triumph, not with anger, with the same diagnostic clarity she had brought to the system itself. Captain Calloway issued appropriate tactical orders within the parameters of his training. Every order was correct for the system he believed he was operating. The system he was actually operating required a different kind of knowledge. That gap does not reflect poorly on his tactical capability. It reflects poorly on the gap itself. The room absorbed this. Calloway absorbed it. It was, in its precise and unsentimental way, the most devastating assessment he had ever received because it contained no malice and therefore offered no defense. You could argue with an attack. You could not argue with a diagnosis delivered by the person who designed the diagnostic system. Briggs moved to a data terminal at the edge of the deck and entered a command sequence. A holographic file appeared in the air beside him, dense, organized with the particular visual language of a flag officer's official service record. He turned it so the deck crew could read it. Most of them chose to. The record scrolled in the blue light of the restored facility. Education, First Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. MYT, 1992. Master of Science in Systems Architecture, Caltech, 1994. Doctor of Philosophy in Quantum Computing, MYT, 2007. Doctor of Philosophy in Systems Architecture, Caltech, 2011. The Navy's Cyber Warfare Advanced Certification Program designation classified. Then assignments, then commendations. Distinguished Service Medal, Defense Superior Service Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. Legion of Merit. The list continued beyond what a single reading could hold. Beside each entry, dates and locations and unit designations, most of them redacted. At the bottom of the record, one line. Lead Architect NC S1 Cerberus. Design Phase 2009 to 2014. Callaway read that line. He had taken command of Cerberus 14 months ago. He had been briefed on its history. He had reviewed its technical documentation, or the portions his clearance permitted him to review. He had understood himself to be the commanding officer of an advanced facility whose underlying architecture was in some technical sense above his expertise. He had not until this moment translated that abstraction into the specific and human reality that the woman in the olive flight suit had written the foundational code of this facility with her own hands when she was a 37-year-old commander over 5 years of iterative work before he had held a command of any kind. He had been a lieutenant when she started building this place. He had been a lieutenant commander when she finished it. And then the other thing arrived. Slower, more complete. He had been sitting 2 rows behind her in a Pentagon conference room in October of 2021, and she had been the woman in the gray suit who said almost nothing and wrote in a narrow, even hand, and he had looked at the back of her head for 3 hours and thought probably a secretary. He had never asked her name. He understood now with a clarity that had no edge he could argue against that she had known exactly who he was. That she had known his record, his posting history, his limitations, and his capabilities with the same thoroughness she knew the architecture of the facility he had been assigned to command. She had known. He had not looked. The sound he made was very quiet. Not a word. Just the sound a man makes when a structure he has been standing on for a long time reveals itself to have been built by someone he looked through without seeing. Briggs turned from the holographic display. His eyes found Callaway and held them with the flat, unsparing attention of a Commodore who has arrived at the moment of delivery. Captain Callaway, you are relieved of command effective immediately. The duty officer will escort you to your quarters. You will remain there pending the formal review process. Callaway did not protest. He did not reach for procedural objections or invoke any of the mechanisms that might have bought him time or softened the landing. He looked at Briggs, and he nodded once with the clean, unqualified acknowledgement of a man accepting a consequence he has earned. Then he looked at Donovan. She was watching him, not waiting for anything from him, not requiring a response, simply present. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the aft entrance. He did not slam the door. The corridor outside the Cerberus command deck was a utilitarian space. Bare metal walls, fluorescent lighting, the kind of institutional blankness that military facilities produce when function has been prioritized over everything else. Callaway walked it with the measured pace of a man who is managing something large, and doing so in the only way available, which is to keep moving and let the movement absorb what the stillness cannot hold. He had almost reached the end of the corridor when he heard footsteps behind him. He stopped. He turned. She was alone. Briggs had remained on the deck. It was just Donovan in the fluorescent corridor, in her plain olive flight suit, looking at him with those gray eyes that had been reading him accurately since before he knew she was in the room. "Have you ever been wrong?" he asked. It was not the question he had planned to ask. It was not the kind of question Robert Callaway asked people as a general principle of how he moved through the world. But the past 14 minutes had rearranged something in the structure of how he asked questions, and the one that came out was the one that was actually there. She did not answer immediately. She walked to the wall of the corridor and stood with her back against the metal, not pressed, not the way she had been pressed against the server rack 40 minutes ago, but resting there with the ease of someone who has decided this is a conversation worth having on solid ground. "In 2001, she said, I was a lieutenant commander at the Defense Advanced Systems Integration Group. I was working under Vice Admiral Wallace Reed. We had a network defense architecture that was ready to deploy a system designed to protect fleet communications against cyber intrusion at a level the Navy wasn't yet taking seriously." Callaway waited. "I found a vulnerability in the deployment architecture 2 weeks before it went live. Small, specific, fixable. I began working the fix without formal authorization because the authorization process would have taken 3 weeks, and I believed we didn't have 3 weeks." She looked at the wall across the corridor, at something that was not there anymore, but was still in certain lights visible to her. A senior officer found out. He told me to stop making unauthorized changes to an approved system. He explained the chain of command to me. He was not wrong about the chain of command. He was completely right about the chain of command. Calloway said nothing. I stood down. I followed the order. I told myself I would find another pathway through proper channels and have the fix authorized before the system went operational. I did not find that pathway in time. 7 weeks after deployment, a targeted intrusion exploited exactly the vulnerability I had identified. 2 naval intelligence officers were exposed during an active operation. Both were dead within 72 hours. The corridor held the silence without asking anything of it. Admiral Reed resigned 6 months later. He told me it wasn't my fault. He was a man who told the truth, so I believed him. But I also understood that the question of fault and the question of consequence are not the same question, and understanding the first does not resolve the second. She reached into her left breast pocket. She did not remove the cable. She touched it through the fabric with 2 fingers. I was wrong, not about the vulnerability, about the pathway. I was 29 years old, and I saw only 2 options: fix it myself or accept the order. I didn't see the third option, which was to escalate. To go over his head through proper emergency channels with the technical documentation I had. That pathway existed. I didn't use it because I was angry, and because I was impatient, and because I had been told so many times in so many rooms that my judgment was less important than my rank, that I had stopped believing the formal channels would move fast enough. She looked at him directly. They might have. I will never know. Calloway had been looking at his hands while she spoke. He looked up. Why are you telling me this? Because you are going to spend the next year trying to understand what happened today. And if you start from the assumption that the problem was arrogance, you will arrive at a solution that is just performance. You will learn to perform humility the same way you performed authority. The problem was not arrogance. The problem was a gap in your model of the world. You had a model that was accurate for everything it included and blind to everything it did not include. That is not a character flaw. That is a structural problem. Structural problems have structural solutions. Calloway was quiet for a moment. You built that flaw deliberately, he said. The loop in Protocol Omega. Yes. You came here because you knew someone would eventually trigger it. I came here because it had already been triggered, she said. 3 days ago, a routine war game ran the Black Spear scenario with a parameter configuration that activated the loop. The system caught itself before Protocol Omega fully engaged. No one on this facility noticed it had happened. That is why I came. Not the near miss itself, the fact that no one saw it. Calloway processed this slowly. If no one noticed the near miss, he said, then the vulnerability that matters isn't in the code. No, she said, it isn't. He looked at her for a long moment. The fluorescent light fell on both of them with the same flat impartiality, the Admiral with no rank visible, and the captain with no command remaining in a corridor connecting a room where everything had changed to whatever came next. I'm not going to tell you what to do with the next part of your career, she said. That is not mine to determine, but the people who understand these systems, the people who can close the gap your facility has, they are already in your chain of command. They have been there. You have looked through them the same way you looked through me. She pushed off from the wall. Start there, she said. She walked back toward the command deck. She did not look back. 3 weeks after the incident, Garrett Kowalski received a package. It arrived through official channels, logged and processed by the base mail office. Unremarkable in its exterior, a standard government-issued transport case, matte black, approximately the size of a hardcover book, with his name and rank on the label in a font that gave away nothing. He signed for it on a Tuesday morning and carried it to the small desk in his quarters and set it down and looked at it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a data slate, thin, high specification, the kind of hardware not standard issue at his rank or his posting. Powered down, no note, nothing else in the case. He turned it on. The screen came up showing a single folder labeled with a designation he recognized immediately: NCS-1 Cerberus Foundational Architecture Annotated. Access level unrestricted. He opened it. The first file was source code dense and extraordinary, written in a style he had been trying to reverse engineer from the system logs he had been permitted to access since the incident, in which he had understood approximately 40% of, despite working on it every evening for 3 weeks. The annotated version had notes in the margins, not explanations, but questions. Why is this pathway slower than the alternative? What does this subroutine assume about the hardware below it? Where is the point of failure if the assumption is wrong? They were the questions of someone who knew that the right question is more durable than any answer. He scrolled to the end of the final file. There was an audio attachment. He sat at his desk with the door of his quarters closed and played it. Her voice was the same as it had been in every setting he had observed it measured unhurried, taking up exactly the space it needed. Ensign Kowalski, what I am giving you is not a gift. It is a responsibility. If it were a gift, I would have sent it to Lieutenant Commander Hatch, who is a better systems engineer than you are right now by a considerable margin. I sent it to you because of what you did on the afternoon of the incident. Not the writing, though the writing matters. What you did was notice the right things. You noticed what I was looking at instead of what everyone else was looking at. You noticed that my behavior did not match the situation as it was being defined by the people with the most authority to define it. And you wrote it down before you understood why it mattered. Kowalski was not moving. That capacity to observe what does not fit to record it before you have decided what it means to keep your own observations separate from the consensus of the room, that capacity is rarer than technical skill. Technical skill can be taught in a year. What you did that afternoon takes most people a lifetime to develop, and some people never develop it at all. A pause, the natural pause of someone choosing the next word with care. I want to tell you something else. I know about the notepad because I reviewed the security footage from the command deck after the incident. I watched what every person in that room did from the moment the first alarm sounded to the moment Commodore Briggs entered. Most of them did what their training told them to do. A few of them froze. One of them, you did something that was not in any training manual. You stood in the middle of a crisis and you observed it as if your primary responsibility was to understand what was happening rather than to intervene in it. You were right. That was your primary responsibility in that moment. Most people your age with something to prove would have attempted to help and made things worse. You correctly assessed the limits of what you could contribute, and you stayed inside them while paying full attention to what was happening outside them. Another pause. Project Chimera is a classified research and development program operating out of Naval Cyber Command. It exists to solve problems that formal acquisition processes cannot solve in the time available. I have been its director for 11 years. The work requires people who do not stop asking questions when a room reaches consensus, who are made uncomfortable by gaps they cannot explain, and who are more interested in understanding a system than in receiving credit for operating it. The recording was nearing its end. He could feel it. You have 14 months before standard rotation would move you from Cerberus. Use them, learn the architecture, not to operate it, to understand it. There is a difference. By the end of 14 months, you should be able to explain that difference clearly to someone who has never thought about it. That will tell you and me whether you are ready for the next conversation. A final pause, shorter than the others. The code in this directory will tell you more about how I think than any conversation could. Start with the questions in the margins. Do not look for the answers. Look for why I asked those questions and not different ones. The gap between what I asked and what I could have asked, that gap is the work. The audio ended. Kowalski sat at his desk for a long time. He opened the first annotated file. He started with the questions in the margins. What happened to Robert Calloway in the year that followed was not a single event, but a slow one, the kind of change that has no dramatic moment you can point to afterward and say, there, that was when it turned. It was a change that happened in accumulation in the space between one day and the next, in the particular way that a man begins to hear things he has always been too loud to hear before. He arrived at the Naval Supply Systems Command Depot outside Fallon, Nevada in early summer. The paperwork cited a standard rotation following the command review. Everyone understood what it actually was. Calloway understood it better than anyone. The depot was a vast flat place, warehouses arranged in a grid against a landscape of scrub and distance, the kind of location that strips away everything not strictly functional, because nothing that is not functional survives the heat and the scale and the indifferent quiet. The people who worked there were invisible to the culture of the Navy that Calloway had spent his career inhabiting. They had no combat records that made it into briefings. They moved components from one place to another with a precision and consistency that the operational Navy depended on entirely and acknowledged almost never. He had been there 9 days when he first watched Petty Officer 2nd Class Douglas Sutton work. Sutton was 41 years old. He had spent 12 years in the Navy as an electronics technician, had been injured during a shore assignment in 2009, had declined a medical discharge, and had spent the subsequent decade managing the depot's most complex inventory, category precision guidance components for advanced weapons systems, with a reliability that the depot's records showed to be essentially perfect. Zero critical errors in a decade of handling material where a single mislabeled component could create a cascade of failures 6 months and 2,000 miles downstream. Calloway watched him one morning for 20 minutes without Sutton knowing he was being watched. He observed the way Sutton's hands moved through the inventory, the specific economical confidence of someone who has done a thing so many times that the doing has become its own kind of knowledge, stored in the hands and the body rather than in the conscious mind. He watched Sutton catch an error in a shipment manifest that two other technicians had already cleared, not by rerunning the verification process, but simply by holding the component and knowing with his fingertips that the weight was fractionally wrong in a way that no calibrated instrument in the depot was fine enough to detect. Calloway walked back to his office and sat at his desk. He thought about the cable. He thought about the corridor outside the command deck and the woman's voice saying the people who understand these systems are already in your chain of command. You have looked through them the same way you looked through me. He had. He was beginning to understand the full cost of that. He started eating lunch in the break room instead of his office. Not to perform approachability, he was not yet good enough at the thing he was learning to perform it convincingly. But because the break room was where the people who knew things he didn't know spent the 20 minutes in the middle of their day when they were not required to perform anything either, he listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, he asked questions rather than made assertions. He was not in these early weeks a natural student of this particular discipline. He was a man who had spent 44 years being the person with the answers, and the muscles required for genuine not knowing were underdeveloped in ways he was only beginning to map. He caught himself frequently, performing attention when he was actually waiting to speak, evaluating what people told him against what he already believed rather than letting the new information be genuinely new. He caught himself and he corrected, slowly, without ceremony, without audience. He thought about what she had said into the corridor. A structural problem has a structural solution. He was rebuilding the structure, one conversation at a time. In the fall of that year, on a Thursday afternoon when the light over the Nevada desert had gone, the particular flat gold it goes in October, Calloway was walking between warehouse units when he passed the open door of a small building housing the depot's communications relay maintenance team. Inside, he could hear someone talking, not to another person, but to a piece of equipment in the low, focused murmur of a technician working through a problem out loud. He stopped. Through the open door, he could see a junior petty officer, 20 years old at most, crouched in front of a relay panel that had been pulled halfway out of its housing. The petty officer was explaining to the relay panel exactly what was wrong with it and why, and what the correct procedure for addressing the problem would be. Not consulting a manual, not running a diagnostic program. Talking through the logic of the system from first principles, the way you work through a complex problem when you need to hear the reasoning in order to trust it. Calloway stood in the doorway and listened for 3 minutes. The petty officer found the fault, fixed it, tested it, put the panel back in its housing with the clean efficiency of someone who has done this many times and sees no reason to add complexity to a simple thing. Then the petty officer turned around and found the captain standing in the doorway and went very still in the particular way young enlisted personnel go still when they realize a senior officer has been watching. At ease, Calloway said. What's your name? Petty Officer Sutton, sir. The young man paused. Douglas Sutton. How long have you been working on relay systems? 4 years, sir. Before the Navy, I worked with my uncle. He runs a communications repair shop in Flagstaff. Calloway looked at the panel. He looked at Sutton. What else do you know how to fix? He said. It was the beginning of a conversation that lasted 2 hours running past the end of the duty day in the low gold light of a Nevada afternoon. Calloway did not talk about himself. He did not talk about Cerberus or the command deck or the thing that had rearranged the architecture of how he understood the world. He asked questions and he listened to the answers, and when he didn't understand something, he said so plainly and asked for a different explanation, and he did not pretend to understand when he didn't. He drove back to his quarters that evening in the particular quietness of someone who has been genuinely changed by something and does not yet have language for it, but understands that the language is not the point. He thought about Donovan standing in the corridor. Start there, he had started. He was continuing. The plaque appeared on the wall of the Cerberus command deck in December. No one ordered it made. No memorandum was issued. No formal request was submitted to the Facilities Management Office at Naval Station Norfolk, which meant that technically the plaque had no authorization to be there and should, by strict operational protocol, have been removed. No one removed it. It was a small thing, brushed aluminum, approximately 8 inches wide and 4 inches tall, mounted at shoulder height on the server rack bulkhead near the secondary maintenance conduit access panel. The text was clean in a simple sans serif font, laser cut into the metal by a technician in the fabrication shop on a Saturday morning as a personal project without telling anyone until it was finished. Efficiency is its own form of elegance. Kowalski had organized the effort. He had mentioned it once to 3 people on the deck crew. The 3 people had mentioned it to others. Within a week, the material costs had been covered voluntarily by 11 members of the Cerberus staff enlisted, and officers alike in amounts ranging from $5 to $50, with no discussion of what anyone else had contributed. They called the location Admiral's Corner. Not officially. There was no official designation. It was simply what they called it, the way places acquire names through repeated use until the name is more real than any formal alternative could be. Before major simulations, junior technicians would sometimes stop at Admiral's Corner for a moment. Not as a ritual, not as anything codified. More the way you pause at a specific spot in a room that has become meaningful, a private acknowledgement of something that resists full articulation but does not require it. Something had changed in the facility since that afternoon. It was not a change anyone had declared or decreed. It had happened the way genuine cultural change always happens, in increments and private decisions, in the accumulation of small moments, where one way of doing things is replaced by another way that works better and asks more. The technicians had begun talking to each other differently. They asked more questions. They challenged their own assumptions before issuing conclusions. When a junior petty officer raised a concern about a system anomaly, the senior staff no longer defaulted to the instinct that a junior concern was probably not worth the time of a senior officer. They stopped. They looked. They asked what had been noticed and how. They had learned through one afternoon of irreversible experience what it costs to overlook the person who has seen the thing no one else is looking at. Kowalski stood in front of the plaque one evening in January after the deck had cleared and the facility was running on minimal staffing. He put his hand on the metal lightly. He had been working through the annotated code for 4 months. He was beginning tentatively to believe he was starting to understand not the answers, but the questions why she had asked those specific ones and not different ones. The discipline of that, the particular mental exercise of staying in the question rather than reaching for the answer, had started changing the way he read everything. Not just code. Reports, briefings, conversations. He had begun to hear in the gap between what people said and what they meant a kind of structure he had not previously known how to listen for. He had been watched the whole time. He had not known it. He thought about the fact that she had not chosen him because he was the best. She had chosen him because he was curious and uncertain and kept his notepad out even when it was embarrassing and wrote down observations before he had decided what they meant. He had been chosen for what he had not known he was doing. He took his hand off the plaque. He turned off the light above his workstation. He walked out of the facility into the cold January air of the Norfolk waterfront where the ships were dark shapes against a darker harbor, and the wind came off the water with the particular insistence of something that has traveled a very long distance before arriving here. He thought about Admiral Donovan somewhere in the classified architecture of Project Chimera, writing questions in the margins of systems that did not yet exist. He thought about Callaway in a Nevada depot, learning the discipline of silence. He thought about Wallace Reed, who had told a 29-year-old lieutenant commander that the only thing that mattered was whether she let it stop her. She had not let it stop her. Kowalski put his hands in his pockets. He walked toward the water. The harbor was quiet. The ships waited in the dark with the steady patience of things built to last. Somewhere in the deeper architecture of the Navy in encrypted channels and classified briefing rooms in late-night sessions, where people who understood systems that most of the world did not know existed worked on problems that most of the world would never hear about. The work continued. It always continued. That was the essential fact about the people who did it. They were not sustained by recognition or the accumulation of formal record or the ceremonies that the institution performed to acknowledge its own values. They were sustained by the work itself, by the particular satisfaction of a problem correctly identified and correctly solved, of a system understood at the level where understanding actually matters, of a gap closed before it could cost what gaps of that kind always eventually cost. Some of them wore their rank openly on their collars, where anyone could read it at a glance. Some of them carried it differently, in a pocket, in a coiled cable worn smooth by years of contact. In the accumulated weight of things they had learned from people who were no longer living, carried forward into every room they entered, applied quietly to every problem they encountered, offered without fanfare to the rare person who had learned how to look. The difference, if you knew how to look for it, was not in what they wore. It was in where their eyes went when everything around them started breaking down. It was in whether they looked at the alarms or at the floor.